Thanks for tuning in to the OCCRL Equity Eye Opener webinar series. This virtual brown bag series is a professional development tool that provides dialogues on equitable practices with the goal of promoting courageous conversations and activist leadership around pervasive tensions and race relations within community colleges. The series features educational leaders, scholars, and practitioners from the Advancing Racial Justice and Equitable Outcomes in Community Colleges Institutes. These individuals are experts in advancing inclusive campus climates and racial equity. We hope you enjoy this talk.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Asif Wilson. I'm the Associate Dean of Instruction at Harold Washington College, and I'm going to be speaking today on the work that we've been doing here at the college and some work I've been trying to articulate in my research, with my research hat on, around collective care for the caregivers that exist on institutional campuses across the US and the world. So I'll get back into this, but before we do that, I'm hoping that you can take a moment to check in with yourself. To think about where you are in this moment. And for me, I'd like you to do that in two ways. Where's your mind right now? Where's your focus? Where's your energy? Where's your attention? And what is distracting you in this moment? How might you be able to put that to the side, momentarily put it in your pocket, put it in your briefcase, in your book bag, in your purse, and return back to it after we get done. And secondly, think about what your body's telling you. So if you can spend a few seconds here going through your body, start with your fingers, your wrists, go up your arms, get in touch with your shoulders, go down your spine, into the seat of your pants, down your legs, into your feet, return up the front of the body till you can get to your face. Go up your trunk, should arrive at your chin, up to your nose. What are your ears telling you? Your forehead, and stop once you get to the top of your head. I think it's really important for me and for the work that I'm going to be talking about today that we constantly check in with ourselves and actually do more than check in and really begin to articulate what we need in the moments and what our bodies are telling us. I think that will become clearer if it is disconnected in this moment as I continue through the presentation. So, before I get into the actual content, I think maybe this is part of the content. I want to talk about who I am and how I with this work. So here's me at the age of 5 for my kindergarten graduation. I think the key here that I'm wearing around my neck is symbolic for the sorts of hopes and aspirations I had for school and education when I was younger. I remember very clearly being 5 years old at the Developmental Institute on Stony Island here in Chicago, tasting sand because my life was centered around play. I remember show and tell because my environment was constructed on collaboration and exchange of ideas. And I guess the other piece for me is that I am the key. The key is around me, so it evokes this asset-based identity in me, in understanding that I had strengths that contribute to the schooling context that I was in. Fast forward a few more years, yes, that is me in the hella oversized clothing, and yes, I wore those clothes for an extended period of time. Luckily, I have changed my wardrobe since, but I think for me, the important piece is the transition that occurred as I got older and continued to interact with schooling spaces. By the time I got to high school, I attended a pretty affluent school in the southern suburbs of Chicago, Homewood Flossmoor. It's a Blue Ribbon Award-winning school. On the surface, seemed like the perfect environment for parents to select for their children. I was able to participate in band, orchestra. There's a number of art options, honors, AP classes. There was a high percentage of us that were college going, but underneath that concrete structure was a place that was a little bit more hostile than it appeared to be on its surface. It was a place where I was told that my blackness didn't matter, and more specifically that all of the Egyptian monuments that existed in the world were not actually created by Africans; they were created by Greeks. Um, and this was told to me by a teacher in a humanities course. It was the same school where the campus community found out I had been accepted into the University of Illinois in a number of microaggressions. I don't think we called them microaggressions at the time, um, and overt racist responses from faculty, from administration, from my peers, with the question revolving around how did you get into Illinois when other people did not? This was actually one of the first years in 2001, to be specific, where there was an influx of applications to the state school, and there were a number of publicized in the media narratives around the number of denials or the high rates of denials to Illinois. So this kind of structural element was very clearly articulated for me in the sort of oppressive interactions I had with my colleagues and with the school around my college, excuse me, my post-secondary aspirations and next steps. And finally, this was the place, not finally, but as I was preparing to go across the graduation stage, we had a small award ceremony for just the students a couple days before graduation. It was like a student performance thing or a talent show where people got to showcase their talents, but also where they handed out a number of awards. And I received the award for Dean's Companion. And instead of a certificate or even, I don't know what sort of accolade I would have wanted nor hoped for in that moment, but I was handed a pair of handcuffs. And so I got called up on stage in front of the entire graduating class at Homewood Flossmoor High School in June of 2001, and I was handed a pair of handcuffs by, I think it's important, by another person of color, by a staff member of color. So I, uh, I shared the story for two reasons. Because one, it was very clear what the institution expected of me. Even though a few months before, it was publicly noted of my next steps in going to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The other important piece I want to share about my coming to this work is the sort of relationship that existed both in the hidden curriculum, but also I imagine was explicit in our community around college going culture and what it meant to go to a community college. And the community college by our house was Prairie State College, which I've come to see as a wonderful space to support students along their aspirations and post-secondary goals. But what the message I learned in high school was that you don't go to community college if you expect it to, quote, be something of yourself. And so I carry all that with me. And I certainly carry it into the space that I enter in every day to do work as associate dean, and that's here at Washington College. We're one of the 7 city colleges of Chicago. And I've spent the last 4 years here really thinking deeply about how to utilize my power and authority to create less harmful conditions for students that not only interrogate the institutional structures and processes and policies here on campus, but actually help me to mend the pain that I am holding on to from my own school experiences. So who I am and why I do this work is very clearly connected to the unresolved pain that I have and the negative dispositions related to community college, students that I hold because of my negative schooling experiences. So even though I went to one of the quote unquote best schools in the country for high school, when we look at that through a racial equity lens, it was a very negative experience for me and other students of color. And so you can Google Homewood Flossmoor High School racist or blackface for a number of other clear examples of overt racist acts. At that high school, sorry, Homewood Flossmoor, y'all got work to do. But I also want to turn this over to you all. Take a moment to think and reflect back on your own educational histories and her stories, to think about what educative trauma you might be holding on to. So think back, was it something in kindergarten, in preschool, your interactions with teachers, with other people, but also your interactions with those structures? What happened when you walked through the door? What did the building say to you? Did you feel a sense of belonging? Did you feel a sense of exclusion? And hold on to those moments. And whether we acknowledge them or not, they live in us. I think science and social science and the indigenous wisdom from the places in which we occupy today have told us that trauma is stored inside of us, that we hold on to trauma. And if left unresolved, that trauma has long-lasting impacts on our minds and our bodies. And for us at Harold Washington, we took all of this and tried to do something about it. And so I want to talk for a moment about the work we have done for the last 2+ years now, around caring not only for our students, but also caring for ourselves. And today I want to focus on the turn inward in our movement towards caring for ourselves. So about 2.5 years ago, Harold Washington College was awarded a no money, yes, I said that, no money grant through the Office of Community College Research and Leadership to really begin to explore deeply developmental education here on our campus. And so we spent a year, about 20 of us, in bi-weekly settings, really looking deeply at the journey of a developmental education student. And once we started examining that journey, to begin to pick at or fracture and hopefully rupture the negative experiences that were created by the structures of the school. Not harming, not doing something to further deficitize the students, but actually to interrogate the structures of our school. And one of the things we noticed very early was our use of language. And the language around developmental education was positioning students as if they had nothing to offer. And for us, we wanted to adopt more asset-based frameworks and asset-based languages, that we hoped would better support our students in developmental education classrooms and in our support service spaces, while also creating less harmful conditions for them in our institutions. So that work was titled Transitional Education Through Affective Methodologies. About a year into that work, at the conclusion of the spring semester last year, we turned to each other, and one of the practices we did in team was check-ins. So essentially, we checked in with each other at the start and the conclusion of every meeting, finding out where we were, how we were feeling, where our frustrations, where our joy was lying. And almost every one of us around that table talked about our exhaustion. And in that moment, I was reminded of a number of colleagues that are no longer here with us, that work in institutes of higher education, that have either taken their own lives or had their lives taken from them because of the stressors placed on us, particularly as students of color or minoritized folks in institutes, or folks that are not part of the dominant mainstream identities existing on campus, or ideologies for that matter. That can be painful. And so we decided to do less of the outward facing work of team. And that outward facing work, meaning the work we were doing with students or for students, and turn that work or that praxis inward so that we can start thinking about what the conditions we need to better care for the students. And we arrived at an essential question that actually created this transition for us, and that is, how can we care for our students if we don't care for each other, if we aren't cared for? And so in this moment, we see advisors, administrators, tutors, and faculty members. Those were the folks that made up the team. We didn't see ourselves anymore as advisors, teachers, administrators, and tutors. We saw ourselves as caregivers who were charged with supporting our students and thus caring for our students. And so we came up with this dialectical relationship in our unpacking of that, and said we also need care too. We've got to care for each other. And furthermore, we cannot rely on these very individualized notions of self-care, or bubble baths or massages or a number of other self-care initiatives that are common in United States culture, and move into the more indigenous and ancestral ways of knowing and interacting with each other that were rooted in each other and our inextricable boundedness to one another. And if we're inextricably bound to one another, then we know that we have some responsibility in caring for each other. And secondary to that, we arrived at this notion that maybe the Institute isn't interested in caring for us. And furthermore, we see this work, this is not a crucial component of the work, but it's an important variable to mention here. We see this work as fugitive work, right? And in the same ways, enslaved folks in the United States had to create secret or very private spaces to learn how to read and write, to navigate the, the complexities of living a life in bondage, and to, for example, use the intricacies of hair braiding to provide roadmaps to freedom. And so we use that same kind of identity or ideology or positioning of fugitivity for enslaved folks in the same ways that we position this work around collective care here in the Institute as an act of fugitivity. If the Institute is not interested in creating the caring conditions for us to do more than survive in these spaces, we have got to carve out those spaces, right? For our own survival, and hopefully for us to think about the conditions and create the conditions for us to thrive. And so now I want to get in a little bit to what exactly we did more pragmatically in team that gets us to this notion of collective care. And I want to share 3 things with you. And I'm going to read a bit of a paper that we're just publishing, so forgive me if the tone switches in my narrative a bit here. And so I want to start by talking about just being. And most of us in team were so busy that our daily work and responsibilities excluded us from creating time in our schedule to eat and nourish our bodies. We know it's important to our survival. However, it wasn't happening. The spatial context created through team to eat together in a collective familial-like setting was both collaborative and imaginative. And Bell Hooks and Cornell West write about this when they talk about breaking bread. And so for us in team, one of those critical components of collective care was breaking bread together, because it provided us a time to just, quote, as I articulate, be. And Cornell West and Bell Hooks remind us breaking bread has to do with a critical recovery and a critical revision of our past, of our traditions, of our histories, of our heritage. Breaking bread, seen as much more than just eating, right, can lead towards our critical understanding of the past and present, and our transformation of the present into a better future. So like rarely are there occasions structured in the school day for faculty, staff, and administration to be with each other. It was in the being that team members were able to reflect on current moments, look forward, and know that we were not alone in our work. One of our team members said this at the end of the semester on a reflection. They wrote, "Biweekly team meetings have shown me that I am not alone in my quest for a more liberatory educational institute. Many of us are engaged in transformational and justice work. We sometimes don't realize it. And this work oftentimes occurs in silos. If we can engage in cross disciplines like we did with team, getting advisors, students, faculty, teachers, and admin in a room learning, discussing, and reflecting together, lots can be accomplished. Now, because the US school system is structured by output, defined and operationalized as the production of quote unquote things or objects for the advancement of the institution in a competitive market, intellectual time to just be is often under siege. Starting team meetings with food, and more importantly, the time to be, created a fracture in the conditions set forth by the institute. And so this first component around breaking bread really allowed us to push back. I think this exemplifies this act of fugitivity I made mention of earlier, but it also provided us with a very connected and collaborative space to get to know each other and connect our lives to each other. The next thing I want to talk about are what we're calling healing centered practices. And so empathy, imagination, critical reflection, and loving action were critical components of teams work together. We use the term healing practices here to demonstrate more pragmatically how team was a space for healing. Not necessarily where healing took place, because healing takes place on survivors' own time. But we tried to create the container that might add folks' toolboxes to begin those healing practices or to support them in those healing practices or to think about healing as a collective act. Healing center practices for team were engaged through a number of collective acts. These practices were reflected in the group's attention to practice care for one another. They varied from meeting to meeting. On one occasion, you might see us doing chair yoga. On other occasions, you might see us writing affirmations and sharing them with one another. We all had accountability partners that would check in on each other outside of our bi-weekly meetings. And on other occasions, we engaged in guided meditation. Excuse me. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. And I'm happy to share more of those practices with folks. Feel free to reach out to me. I think what becomes important here is understanding the need to restore and sustain the adults who are attempting to heal the work. Here I'm borrowing from the work of Sean Dinwright. And so we heard a number of folks express appreciation for teams' healing-centered practices because they not only reaffirmed our existence, but they provided us with the energy to be, as one member stated, be ready, quote, end quote, for the future. And furthermore, I think our check-ins and other healing center practices supported a familial kinship relationship amongst team members. Through deep connections that we built over time, we knew we could depend on one another, imagine the sort of world we hope to live in together, and engage in collective practice with each other to construct the conditions for that future world. The third component that I want to share with you around teams work and our collective care efforts was political education, as we called it. This helped us to better see the conditions that we were faced with in navigating. It was a crucial component to our collective care efforts. Without a strong understanding of the structures of oppression existent in our lives and in our school, we may have continued to blame ourselves for the pain we were experiencing. Without constant affirmations of our existence and constant affirmation that this work was fugitive, we may have continued to reproduce oppressive conditions for our students, even under the guise of, quote, trauma-informed care, end quote. Like during our time together in team. We read articles, we watched videos, we listened to narratives from each other, from our students, that validated, this is the important piece here, that validated our experience, that named and illuminated a decolonial praxis, and helped us to develop vocabulary and epistemological conceptualizations of the work we were engaged in together. Political education in team was really important because it helped us to move away from these individualized analyses of the world that see people as creators of pain or see people as healers of pain towards more structural understanding of justice and equity, liberation, and agency. I want to go back to Jenright here for a moment. He reminds us that, well, building an awareness of justice and inequality combined with social action contribute to overall well-being, hopefulness, and optimism. Here, political education represents an awareness of the structures of oppression and also the motivations of liberation. Both provided really meaningful examples and roadmaps for a team to learn from. I think, just to kind of summarize the work of team here a bit, our shift to create more effort on care for ourselves, the caregivers, as I talked about earlier, seem to be a really important move for us, a critical move, in fact. We used asset-based approaches that built upon our experiences, knowledge, skills, and curiosities, as opposed to our deficit. Um, this provided us the space to be, a space to learn together, and a space to heal together. While these healing-centered collective care efforts were used for our own well-being, they seem to impact how we interacted with students, supporting the claim that if we do care for each other, we may, as a result, have a stronger capacity to better care for our students. I'll just kind of conclude here by sharing a quote a team member said at the end of last year, and they wrote, quote, "Students come to us with many life experiences, both positive and negative, that shape their learning and development. Team allowed us to learn how to support students and provide them a space to name and frame their experiences." I think in this quote, we see the symbiotic nature of team, both as a space for us to focus on ourselves, to do that collective care work, but while doing so, we were also focusing on our students. And so I want to end by returning back to the frame, the container. I didn't start with the frame because this work was generative of our experiences. And while it was guided by a framework, it was initiated by our lived realities. And I think that's the important piece to tease out here. But I do want to talk about what's framing this work for us. And so Sean Jenright, who I've mentioned a couple times already through this webinar, created this framework that he has coined healing-centered engagement. And for Jenright, healing-centered engagement has 4 tenets. And I'll review each of those with you. He argues that healing-centered engagement is political. Quote, "Communities and individuals who experience trauma are agents in restoring their own well-being. This subtle shift suggests that healing from trauma is found in awareness and actions that address the conditions that created trauma in the first place. Healing-centered engagement views trauma and well-being as a function of the environments where people live, work, and play." This is connected to our work on political education. For us, it was really important to go beyond the traditional kind of individualized notions of blaming other people for this. And by better understanding the systems and structures that exist in the world and thus in our school that may cause pain, we were building our political analysis of the world, helping us to determine more structural and process-based interventions as opposed to individualized interventions that only support students' resilience in a toxic environment and do very little to transform the toxicity. And so that analysis becomes really important The second component Ben Wright argues is critical for healing-centered engagement is this idea of restoration. And he writes, healing-centered engagement embraces a holistic view of well-being that includes spiritual domains of health. This goes beyond healing only from the lens of mental health and incorporates culturally grounded rituals and activities to restore well-being. For team, because most of us were folks of color, an important demographic caveat I think to mention, we also were bringing our cultural practices, traditions, and belief systems into that space. And because we were culturally grounded in that work, I guess you can say our work around collective care was grounded in a holistic view of well-being that went beyond our very westernized epistemologies of mental health. More of that, and I'll share a paper in a second. You can take a look at to explain more. The third piece is that healing-centered engagement is asset-based, much like our vocabulary and sense of belonging interrogation here through Team for our developmental education students. Healing-centered engagement is, quote, a departure from solely viewing young people, and in our case, our students, college students, through the lens of harm and focuses on asset-driven strategies that highlight possibilities for well-being. An asset-driven strategy acknowledges that young students, or college students in our case, are much more than the worst thing that happened to them and builds upon their experiences, knowledge, skills, and curiosities as positive traits be enhanced. One of the important things that I didn't get to around our political education and our healing-centered practices in team was that they were led by members of team. They were not led by outside facilitators. So we would use our own assets, our own strengths, our own experiences to construct our collective toolboxes that became our collective care initiative. Seeing through this lens, we were not just holders of pain, but we were also holders of resilience, of resistance, of liberation, of positive, holistic, hopeful, aspirational experiences that could help us to support each other. And the fourth component of healing-centered engagement that became central for our work on collective care is that healing-centered engagement has an explicit focus on restoring and sustaining the adults who attempt to heal you, a healing the healers approach. And so for us, and you can read more about this in a paper that's actually just got accepted for publication. So we're really excited coming out. That's articulating this framework that my a colleague of mine, Richardson, and I have really spent some time articulating and working around. We're calling it healing-centered collective care. So we're extending Jen Wright's healing-centered engagement framework to think about how we create the conditions for well-being amongst the caregivers in institutes of higher education. And so in that vein, healing-centered collective care is political, it is restorative, and it is asset-based. I think more pragmatically, we can go back to the work that emerged from teams to think about how that framework emerged generatively in our own space. And so now, given the framework, given the examples I've shared with you from team, I want to move us into a space of action. And as we conclude, I'd like you to consider your move. I want you to take a moment to think about two important questions related to collective care. One, how might you take this work back to your spaces? Right? What sorts of ecosystems are you in? Those might be school spaces, those might be kitchen tables, those might be after school programs, those might be in conversations with your dissertation committee. They might mean an interview. The important thing is that we consider how this work applies to our own space, because context is so important to me and helps distinguish space A from space B. This work will look differently in every space. It should look differently I think it's really important for you to think about contextual factors that will make your own collective care initiatives unique. Coupled with that, I also think it's really important for us to think about what support you will need. I think if I can offer any advice for folks engaging in this work is do not do it alone. So be thinking about who your squad is, who your opposition is, and how you will work in that gray area, in the dialectical relationship between your allies and your opponents to create spaces that support the well-being of all. And so I think it's really important to think about what support you might need in those efforts if you do choose to create more collective care initiatives in your own spaces. And given that reflexive work that I just encourage you to do, feel free to reach out to me if you have questions, comments, you want to talk through some of this work. I am here at the college all year round. And in between meetings, I'd love to hear about how you are making this work visible and supportive of folks in your own spaces and supportive of you. So please reach out to me. Let me know how this work is going for you on your campuses, what we can do to collectivize our efforts in building and sustaining the sort of world we want to live in one day. And on that, I thank you for spending your time with me. It was a pleasure being in community, even though virtually with all of you, regardless of where you're watching this, how you're watching, or engaging in this work. I hope you take some of it and make meaning of it for yourself and for the other people that you are interacting with. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining. We appreciate your interest in advancing inclusive campus climates and racial equity. We encourage you to listen to our other Equity Eye Opener webinars, which are available on the OCCRL website. Just look for the project page labeled Advancing Racial Justice and Equitable Outcomes in Community Colleges Institutes.